Hello second years, welcome to Holism versus Reductionism. As you can see from the specification here, you are on the home stretch. Holism and Reductionism is down here. We just have ideographic and nomothetic to go. So you need to be able to tell me what the term holistic means, or holism. You need to be able to tell me what the term reductionism means, or something's reductionistic. We need to be able to discuss the levels of explanation within psychology. So there are different levels of reductionism within psychology. And then biological reductionism you need to be aware of, and environmental reductionism, which are very similar, although slightly different from biological and environmental determinism. So determinism, as we've talked about before, is all about choice, and whether we've got choice over our behaviour, and reductionism is all about explaining behaviour. So there is a difference, so please be ever so careful. And on examiners' reports it says that students start to fall into other types of the debate, so please try and remember that they are different. Okay, so here are some examples of some questions. Briefly outline what psychologists mean by levels of explanation for 2 marks, and nice and simple. Outline and evaluate reductionist explanations in psychology, so that you'd focus on reductionism. And then also you've got the 16 marker. And the most important thing to notice about the 16 marker is that there's a quote in there: the best way to understand and explain behaviour is to reduce it to its simplest component parts, which is a definition of reductionism. So it says, in the context of the holism reductionism debate, so remember it's a debate, they're asking for the debate here, discuss this view. And refer to at least one topic in your answer. So I've embedded psychological theories and topics as we go along, but again, that you don't have to use those ones. You can use whatever we've studied before, but just make sure you have some examples. Okay, so holism and reductionism, the definition is there: breaking down complex ideas into more simple components. And the idea of holism comes from Occam's razor. And what I think is really important to explain here is, previously when I've taught this subject and I've used this example of Occam's razor, particularly this image, students potentially get a little bit confused. Occam's razor, the word razor, just Occam is a person and a monk. The razor does not mean an actual physical razor. Razor just means like a concept, a law, a rule, a thought, an idea or belief. Here, not a physical razor. However, the image does lend itself to the concept. So if you're choosing between 2 solutions, this is Occam's razor, then it's all, and both solutions could explain the behaviour effectively, you would always go for the simplest explanation. If both of them explain behaviour equally effectively, then always go for the simplest one. And reductionism is similar to this, so it's breaking down complex ideas into more simple components. So complex human behaviours into their simple and individual components. For example, we've looked at quite a few of these and we will touch on them more, but for example, OCD. OCD is an extremely complex behaviour that can be explained or is influenced by many different things potentially. However, reductionism, we reduce it down to its simplest form. So in this case we talk about OCD being about different levels of neurotransmitter, or a particular gene, and it's as simple as that, and we ignore all of those other contexts around it. So the broader context of who's in the environment with them, and also even broader than that is the political climate, the current society they're in. Does that cause OCD as well? So we ignore all of that, we break it down into its simplest parts. Okay. And then levels of explanation. So these are the different reductionist levels of explanation. So this fits with reductionism, as it says on the image, is a belief that human behaviour can be explained by breaking it down into simpler components. And then there are levels of explanation going from the lowest level of reductionism. So this is where we reduce it down to its absolute simplest forms, to highest level of reductionism, which is where we look at culture and social explanations. So again, we've reduced it down to one particular thing. We're not considering all 3 of the levels together. We're reducing behaviour down separately. Okay, so the example that we've got here is memory, and this is from the Tutor to You website, so a really good place to go and have a look for some other things. So biological explanations of memory, as we know, we've talked about Beardsley and Squires, who found that the hippocampus is in your long-term memory and that short-term memory is in the prefrontal cortex. So that is simplifying the extremely complex behaviour of remembering information, lots of different types of information, down to a biological cause, and that's a biological explanation. So the lowest or the simplest level of reductionism is the biological explanation. Okay, psychological explanations, they fit with, as it says there, cognitive, behavioural, environmental, so they're the next step up. So for example, continuing the idea of memory, exactly as it says here, we've got the capacity of short-term and long-term memory, and the capacity and the duration. So Miller and Peterson looked at the capacity and the duration, and that's a cognitive aspect of memory. So biological aspect, physical, this structure in the brain relates to this memory. Psychological explanations are cognitive. It acknowledges memory as an internal mental process. And then you have social and cultural explanations. So this is the idea that, unsurprisingly, as the name suggests, so the society and the culture that we live in influences our experiences. And again, in this case, we're looking at memory and the idea that depending on what kind of culture you are in, impacts the way that you can affect that you remember certain information. And it says there Bartlett 1932, and we're going to look at Bartlett's War of the Ghosts, and we're going to see if your culture impacts on the way that you recall a story. So just leave a little bit of space in your books for that one, to add that in class, because it will become clearer. We could do that to absolutely anything. Any of these different ones. So depression, low levels of serotonin, that's a biological explanation. Psychological explanations could be around experiencing cognitive, so it would be irrational thought processes triggered by an event, so the ABC model or the negative triad. And then socio and cultural explanations could be the fact that there's an increased level of depression when there is some kind of political upheaval. So when Brexit happened, there was an increase in levels of poor mental health, including depression, and lots of other examples I'm sure you could think of as well if you had one that you preferred more. Okay, so you need to be aware of holism and reductionism. We've talked about the levels of explanation. You also need to be aware of the different types. So there is biological reductionism, which is reducing behaviours down to its simple, from a complex behaviours down to its simplest biological form. And you've got neurochemistry, neurophysiology, evolution and genetics, and we could apply OCD to most of those. So neurochemistry, we've talked about dopamine and serotonin, so low levels of serotonin and high levels of dopamine. Genetic, we've got the SERT gene and the COMP gene. Evolution, you could talk about some of the behaviours we discussed in Nature versus Nurture, and how they might explain why we develop different human behaviours. Arguably, you could suggest that OCD, so particularly if we're going for very stereotypical behaviour of OCD, so anxiety about dirt or germs, well, that's actually evolutionary, because we should be, as an adaptive trait, if we avoid germs, we're more likely to survive and pass on our DNA. Obviously it's an extension or an extreme version of that behaviour, but there is an evolutionary explanation. You wouldn't need to explain all of those, but you would want to illustrate the point. Very complex behaviour of OCD reduced down to biological explanations such as genes and neurotransmitters. Environmental reductionism, also sometimes called stimulus and response reductionism, reduces very complex behaviours down into the very simple idea that we experience a stimulus and then we have a response to that stimulus. And the example here is the behaviourist approach. So the behaviourist approach, we don't study the black box, we're not interested in cognitive thought processes, all we're interested in is explaining behaviours through providing the correct stimulus and therefore experiencing a response. Because it's humans, we've got to keep it with humans, so we're going to go with attachment. So the idea of associating the mother with food and satisfaction from being fed, and therefore that develops an attachment. So the stimulus of the food leads to the response of attachment. Or if you prefer, you could talk about phobias. So again, an extremely complex behaviour that's reduced down to its very simple form. The idea that if you associate a stimulus with a fear response, you will develop a phobia. And of course, you could talk about little Albert and the white rats there. So the idea that there was the loud noise, little Albert associated the loud noise with the white rat, and therefore developed a phobia of white rats, ignoring anything else. So any genetic vulnerability to phobias, I think about ignoring biological preparedness, the idea we're more likely to develop phobias to things that are going to harm us in some way. That's why spiders and snakes and heights are very high up on the phobia list, because it's much more easy to develop a phobia of those. So that's it, they're the two different types. Then you've got the other side of the debate, so you've got holism. So holism is comes from Gestalt psychology, so the idea that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. So it's the completely opposite end of the spectrum to reductionism. So it kind of views reductionism as this image down here. It suggests that rather than breaking behaviours down, so looking at this circle and then this circle and trying to understand what that circle or that behaviour tells us, that cause, really it's much more effective to put all the pieces together and try and understand the behaviour from a whole perspective. So the whole is greater than all of the parts individually taken apart and inspected. Okay, and exactly as it says there, any attempt to break up behaviour is ineffective, as human behaviour should be understood as a whole. And the approach that you're going to look at in more detail after Issues and Debates is the humanist approach, and that is one of the very few psychological theories which is truly holistic. Holism arguably goes against what psychology is, because if you're looking at psychology as a science, because reductionism allows us to consider cause and effect and conduct psychological experiments, which are two things that holism goes against, the idea of being able to conduct empirical research. Okay, so that's reductionism and holism. There is less to talk about in holism, and you will be able to talk about a little bit more when you know more about the humanist approach as well. So make sure you've got that down, and the idea that it considers human behaviour as a whole, but other than that, when we look at holism, you'll be able to add more to it. Okay, arguments that support the idea of reductionism. So now we're on to the AO3. One of the biggest strengths, which I just touched on the last slide, was that it allows for testability. So if we are able to break down human behaviours into simple, identifiable, operationalizable variables, so if we can break a behaviour down into, for example, as it says there, the MAOA gene for aggression, it then allows us to test that. So we can look at people who have the MAOA gene, and we look at people who don't have it, and then we can measure their levels of aggression. If we don't break behaviours down into those simple forms, it's impossible for us to conduct empirical research, because we can't control for every factor. The idea is that this allows us to explore cause and effect and identify cause and effect as well. And also the example, if you prefer an environmental reductionism example, then Pavlov's dogs. Pavlov was able to conduct research by looking at the dog's behaviours before the association. The only thing that changed was the association, so we can be confident of cause and effect, and we're able to test it, and that was able to explain a behaviour. Then we also have implications, I should say 4 treatments, apologies, so implications for treatments. So again, because we're able to identify cause and effect, that allows us to be able to predict behaviours, and therefore we can treat behaviours. So if we can identify cause and effect, we can predict that somebody will be suffering with OCD, or we can identify that somebody will be suffering with OCD because of low levels of serotonin, so cause and effect. We can be confident it's low levels of serotonin, so therefore therefore we can provide them with SSRIs, and that makes a reductionist approach much more effective because it can improve people's quality of life. And then just a little add-on that you might want to include as well that's a positive, it also reduces and removes any blame from the participants because you're able to reduce it down to one particular thing. Okay. Against reductionism is the idea, and I'm sure you've spotted this already, that it misses the complexities of human behaviours. So the argument from holistic psychologists or psychologists who hold a holistic view is that reducing behaviours down loses their meaning, therefore reducing the validity of the theory. For example, if we think about the example of finger pointing, if we consider it from a biological point of view, the which part of the brain needs to be stimulated, the motor cortex, and then that runs neurons nerves take the information down, and the arm moves using the muscles in the arm and the finger to point your finger. And that's it. You can explain how the finger pointing happens, and that would be because you've reduced it down to its simple biological form. But what you can't do is explain why it's happened, because you're ignoring the social environment or the social context. So is it pointing to tell somebody where something is? Is it pointing or is it pointing out of aggression because it's angry and it's telling somebody off? Okay, and that could be extremely aggressive, so pointing right at somebody because you're just about to fight them, or it could be kind of giving someone some guidance, and sometimes I find I do it as well when I'm thinking. So if we think about from a biological perspective, it tells us how but not the why, and the whole point of psychology is to understand why humans behave the way that they do, so therefore reducing the validity. Reductionism has also implications again for treatment, which does follow on quite nicely from the complexities of the behaviour. Because it's very reductionistic, any treatments that come from it again might miss some complexities because the behaviour is too reduced. For example, there was a psychologist called Wolpe who identified a woman who had a phobia of insects, and he tried to cure her through the process of systematic desensitisation, or tried to reduce her symptoms, and he found it wasn't effective. However, when they discussed it more broadly, it was found that her husband had an insect, she was having marital problems, and her husband had an insect nickname, and it was actually that was causing the anxiety and the phobia. So because Wolpe had approached it from a reductionist point of view and simplified it down to a process of association, he missed the wider context, and therefore the treatment was ineffective. And exactly like it says, it distracts from more appropriate levels. So another example would be depression. And this is something that is a really contemporary debate that's happening at the moment, the fact that we are over prescribing medication for depression. Now, that doesn't mean that people shouldn't receive medication for depression. What it means is that we are focusing very much on there only being a biological explanation for depression, and not considering that there are much more broader and varied ideas. For example, social reasons, as I mentioned before, it could be the political or the historical context. So there's potentially more mental health needs for lots of different reasons in people whose previous generations and current generations experience trauma. For example, there's an argument that people from slave backgrounds where their ancestors have been slaves still experience increased mental health issues, and that's arguably because of historical context that's being ignored, but also the prejudice that still exists today. So we've extremely complicated lives as humans. So that, for that example, giving people drugs would only go so far, or medication would only go so far. So we need to be very careful, and that can sometimes impact the validity of the treatments that are developed if we take a reductionist approach. Okay. Flipping that on its head, if we consider holism, so I've tried to keep these as similar as possible, so hopefully you can see, so you don't feel you've got to remember as much. So on the flip side, a strength of holism is that it considers the complexities of behaviours. So we have extremely complex behaviours, and if we consider all of the the behaviour as a whole, generally we might be more able to explain why that behaviour exists. So again, from a biological point of view, if we reduce it down to a biological explanation, we can explain how the finger points because of which part of the brain and what muscles move, and that's always the same every time. But we can also explain, if we look from a more holistic point of view, from a social point of view, we would more effectively be able to explain why that happened. So because they were angry, because they were pointing somebody in a direction, because they were pointing to something on the desk to show someone where it was, whatever it might be. Okay. Having a more holistic view also has implications for treatment as well. So it's been consistently found that whilst drug therapy is effective and cognitive, for example, therapy is effective, what is most effective is a combination of several different treatments, and reflecting on the patient's life and considering what kind of holistic and whole changes they can make. So therefore the treatment's more effective, making it more valid, a more valid treatment, and therefore potentially holism a more valid approach to explaining human behaviours. However, it does not allow for testability. If from a holistic point of view, we say we should consider absolutely everything, we should consider the whole picture. Therefore, we can't pinpoint one particular thing, we can't control everything else in the environment, just change that one thing and then see if an effect happens. So we can't empirically test it, and therefore we can't identify cause and effect. And if we can't identify cause and effect, well, arguably psychology exists to explain human behaviour. And if we can't do that in a valid and reliable way, and if we can't test it and therefore explain that human behaviour, then holism isn't an effective or a valid way to explain human behaviour. Okay, and then implications, again, I should say for treatments, is the fact that if we're not able to predict behaviour, if we can't test cause and effect and therefore identify people with low serotonin might suffer from OCD or depression, then we can't provide a treatment. And again, psychology is all about explaining human behaviour and improving the human experience, so trying to support people to improve their mental health. So if we can't do that, is holism the most effective way to most effective approach to psychology? Okay.